Sir Keir Starmer, Your Majesty.
Your Majesty.
You must be utterly exhausted and nearly on your knees. But not much. Quite a grueling. Yes. Anyway, you're here.
Yes. It's a very sort of quick changeover.
I know, to say the least. And having to get to grips with everything straight away must be quite exhausting.
In recent weeks, the UK has witnessed truly stunning developments as a dangerous rift has emerged between Prime Minister Keir Starmer and King Charles, threatening to undermine not only the government but the monarchy itself. The crux of the conflict lies in the two senior figures' conflicting views on policy towards Ukraine. The King, worried about the economic fallout from President Trump's threat to impose sweeping tariffs on British goods, has called for a diplomatic solution that could ease tensions and avert economic disaster for the country. Starmer, however, is not relenting and is standing firm in his hardline stance in support of Ukraine, despite deteriorating relations with America and growing discontent at home. This open interference by the monarchy in the political differences between the government and the King came as a real shock to the public. Britain, accustomed to the traditional neutrality of the royal family in matters of politics, suddenly found itself on the verge of a large-scale political and constitutional catastrophe, and the whole country froze in anticipation of how this unprecedented conflict between the two forces of power would end.
Do you acknowledge that this has undermined your message and reputation, and are you sorry about that?
Well, I think it's important just to put it in its context. Any gift or donation to a politician has to be declared. Everything I've had has been declared. And sitting behind the numbers, there's some human explanations. So quite a lot of that money was for tickets for football matches. I pay for my own tickets at Arsenal. I've got season tickets. Unfortunately, I can't sit in the stand anymore for security reasons. And the club have said, well, in which case, be our guest in the director's box, if and when there's space. Now, no money changes hands. You can't buy a ticket, but then the register says, well, what's the amount that would be the equivalent, even though you didn't buy the ticket, and that has to be declared.
Yes.
Now, that means if I didn't do that, I couldn't go to Arsenal. I go with my boy. Second example I'll just give you is some of that money was for the loan of a flat during the election period. No money changed hands.
Yes, and that was related to your son.
Yeah, there was no cash adjustment. We had a situation where the election was called, not when we expected it, I think most people. My son happened to be in the middle of his GCSE.
King Charles, with a deep understanding of his role as protector of the interests of the people, could not remain indifferent to the economic threat hanging over Britain. The tariffs that President Trump was threatening to impose on British goods risked devouring the country's economy, sending it into recession and leaving thousands of families in poverty. By knowing how hard workers and entrepreneurs in Britain would be hit, the King made the incredibly bold decision to intervene in his government's policies. He began openly urging Prime Minister Starmer to change his approach, withholding support for Ukraine to avoid the economic consequences for British industry. Anxiety was rumoured to reign in Buckingham Palace. The King himself felt that the country was on the brink of disaster. In Charles's eyes, the most important goal was to ensure the welfare of his subjects and to prevent damage from the diplomatic rigidity that Starmer was displaying. In private conversations with his closest advisors, the King made no secret of his disappointment in the Prime Minister, believing his stance to be overly rigid at a time when flexibility was necessary to maintain economic stability. Supporting Trump on this issue became for Charles a matter of not only political, but also national survival. The conflict between Prime Minister Starmer and King Charles reached such proportions that their clash was no longer solely diplomatic, but a true political cataclysm. The disagreement, which had begun as a private debate within the walls of Buckingham Palace, now flared openly in full view of the whole of Britain. Starmer, despite growing discontent within his government, steadfastly refused to change his position on Ukraine, even in the face of the threat of an economic crisis. The King, for his part, continued to insist on the need for a diplomatic settlement, emphasizing that the UK economy could not survive under trade sanctions. His intervention, highly uncharacteristic of the monarchy, alarmed not only politicians but also ordinary citizens. But many have begun to wonder how far the King might go in his struggle to protect the national interest if his warnings are ignored. The disagreements between the two threatened to destroy not only their personal relationship, but also the very foundation of the country's political structure. In the eyes of the public, the situation was becoming increasingly dramatic, and many began to see in the King the last hope for salvation from the economic disaster they believed Starmer had imposed.
Prime Minister, thanks for joining us on Sky News today. During the general election, you campaigned on a message of change, of doing politics differently and making yours a government of service. And yet you find yourself caught in a row over the huge amount of freebies you've accepted while leader of the opposition, £107,000, far more than any other MP.
The constitutional crisis that erupted between Prime Minister Keir Starmer and King Charles confronted Britain with an uncharted legal landscape. Never before had a monarch intervened in such a blatant political disagreement, and the public began to wonder, to what lengths could a king go to protect the interests of his country? Despite the tradition that the monarch acts on the advice of the government, historical precedents suggest that if the national interest is threatened, the king can use his reserve powers, including the ability to call for new elections. This is not just a legal dilemma, it is a real test of modern British parliamentarianism. Constitutional experts, not without excitement, began to debate whether in this situation King Charles could take decisive steps to avert economic disaster and put the country back on the path to stability. While the king continued to raise questions about the security and economic well-being of Britons, Starmer continued to argue that his tough stance on Ukraine and support for President Trump were necessary to protect democracy. However, with each passing day of the gap between the two, the risk that royalty might move beyond its traditional powers became more apparent, forcing the country to face a new, possibly momentous, stage in the history of the British monarchy.
No money exchanged hands, we didn't, no money exchanged hands, but for the registrar, no, but you've put it to me, let me just finish. For the registrar's purposes, he says, well, I know you didn't pay and nobody gave you money, but let's work out what it would have been worth if it had been a commercial transaction, which it wasn't. So I'm not saying, of course I understand why you ask questions, etc. But I do think sometimes it's important just to sort of look behind the number and say, what was the human story behind some of this? And I wasn't going to let my son fail or not do well in his GCSEs because of journalists outside our front door. We also, as you know, had protesters outside our front door.
Do you find these questions hard?
With each passing day, the growing tension between King Charles and Prime Minister Keir Starmer drew more and more public attention. The king's support among citizens was gaining strength, and he found himself at the centre of the political arena as the only leader willing to defend the interests of the British. Thousands of people took to the streets with placards supporting the monarch and urging Starmer to reconsider his position. Even those who had not previously shared enthusiasm for the monarchy now began to see the king as a symbol of common sense and real concern for the country's future. While the Starmer government was losing the trust of the people by the day, the Prime Minister's political opponents were using the situation to their advantage. The leader of Reform UK, Nigel Farage, instantly seized the chance and organised a tour of the country, declaring that only the king understands what it means to protect jobs and the UK economy. Farage and his supporters managed to gather huge support, creating a new political alliance that increasingly became a threat to Starmer's position. These developments were undermining the already fragile position of the Prime Minister, who found himself isolated from both elites and ordinary citizens. The political picture of Britain was changing before our eyes, and the situation was becoming increasingly alarming for the government.
That means there are a lot of journalists outside the front door and in the street. I'm not complaining about that, but if you're 13, as my girl is, if you're 16, as my boy is, that's quite hard to navigate when you're concentrating on GCSEs. Now, hear me out, because you put it to me.
Yeah.
So I said, we're going to get you out of here and get you somewhere where you can just study and get to school and back without having to go through all of that. And that's when someone said, well, in which case I can make this flat available to you. It's safe, secure, he can get on with the job. No money exchanged hands, we didn't, no money exchanged hands, but for the registrar, no, but you put it to me, let me just finish. For the registrar's purposes, he says, well, I know you didn't pay and nobody gave you money, but let's work out what it would have been worth if it had been a commercial transaction, which it wasn't. So I'm not saying, of course I understand why you ask questions, etc. But I do think sometimes it's important just to sort of look behind the number and say...
In recent days, the UK stood on the threshold of a historic political decision. The conflict between Prime Minister Keir Starmer and King Charles had reached its climax, and the country was now waiting to see what step the king would take to resolve this unprecedented situation. With each passing day, the rift between the government and the monarchy became more and more apparent, and the issue was no longer just about Ukraine or economic sanctions. It was about the very future of Britain's political structure. Like events in which the monarch openly confronts the Prime Minister for the first time in modern history lead to real constitutional reform. Or might King Charles be forced to take more radical measures, up to and including using his reserve powers to dissolve Parliament and call new elections? The risks for Prime Minister Starmer were becoming catastrophic. His support in Parliament and among the electorate was shrinking by the day, and the monarch, despite the strictness of tradition, continued to attract more and more supporters, believing that only with his intervention could economic disaster be averted. The question that now worried the whole country was who would win in the end: the Prime Minister, who was stubbornly defending his position, or the King, who was ready to put everything at stake to protect the interests of Britain.